So just finally, perhaps before we come to audience questions, I just wanted to raise one final thing that Ed said, which was on the cultural deficiency. And you know, in Barwell, where I live and where I was councillor for until May, you know, we've been campaigning to try and keep open our local library. And there's this big issue in Leicester, and no doubt not just in Leicestershire, in terms of you know, trying to not see these great institutions close because local government, and they then blame central government, say that these aren't essential services, and you know, therefore, sorry folks, but unless volunteers can take them over, we will close these libraries. And obviously, you mentioned the situation with museums. So, I mean, you know, in my view, if we lose these great institutions, you know, I always call libraries universities for the masses, then that is in a sense a human right lost, isn't it? And yet some people have been up in arms about it, and others not, and it's difficult to get a steam ahead to really tackle government on this. So I mean, Maria, do you want to start on that one?
Yes, this is an interesting question. You know, I'm Portuguese, and I was born in a country which had the dictatorship for 40 years. And I don't, you know, probably many people in this room don't know much about the Portuguese dictatorship, but it was interesting and different from other dictatorships in Italy and Spain, because what Salazar did when he was in power for about 40 years was to stop social mobility and keep the masses illiterate. So no access to museums, no access to local libraries, and that was very powerful in keeping the dictatorship on. So I think that it's an anecdote that tells you when a government closes local libraries and restricts access to museums, what is it doing? Is preventing people of being critical human beings, people of cultivating their human capabilities. So it's really, really serious. Although, you know, I'm not sure everyone would see it through this angle, but, you know, the way I was brought up, thinking that democracy is not something we take for granted. I was only 2 years old when there was the revolution, makes me think that these are precious things, and I'm not sure how many, you know, if people really value these. So these discussions should happen, and they are definitely a threat to human rights, the right to education and the right to have a life with dignity, where you can be a critical and thinking human being and think independently.
Ed?
So they are universities, libraries are universities.
Yes, that's what I was called, yes. Universities for the masses.
I like that, I like that.
I think we should think outside the box completely. I really shocked the point at which our investment in public services, creation of the NHS, aid abroad was at its highest. It was when we had the highest debt post World War II. And actually the answer was to get our way out of the hole rather than just hope that things got better. I think the devastation of libraries, you know, living in rural South Lincolnshire as a boy, libraries were crucial. It was what, you know, Wednesday night was late night opening. That's where I cycled 8 miles to get to the library, and I spent 6 or 7 hours there until my mum would come and pick me up, and we had a car big enough I had to put the bike in the back because it was dark, and there weren't street lights back to the village I lived in. But also WEA, you know, all born out of a Workers' Education Association, born out of a desire to educate people who didn't otherwise have access to it. I wonder if we could think outside the box. So I almost want to do a plea to pub owners, saying actually pubs don't have to be about the sale of alcohol and pints of beer. Actually, the pub could be the polling station, which it is once a year often, but it could be the library, it could be the meeting point, it could be accessible to communities that don't drink alcohol. Gosh. Where I live in Zone 2 in London, we've got a very friendly gay priest that the bishop's trying to drive out because he's got married to his male partner, but he has 2 churches, and one was basically falling in numbers and one is broadly successful due to an influx of evangelical, largely African communities. But in his church that was failing, he's put the post office in. The post office was shutting on the high street, and so they put a bid in to take the post office over, and the church is now thriving because he's added in a playgroup that is open to anyone who applies and anyone who goes. So we're having a conversation with this successful church about whether we could open in one of the aisles, apses that doesn't have much religious activity, whether we can open a local museum that captures people's memories of now. And then in no time at all you start to get information about the past, but also the now becomes the past. I think we just, as a society, I could wait for the economy to uplift and for someone else to do something else, but I think I'm a bit bored of that because it doesn't happen quick enough for me. So we're having a conversation with the priest, 3 or 4 of us interested in history, about whether or not we can take over one of his chapels and create a museum of Kilburn. It's a community that doesn't really have a collective identity, and start a museum that records the live memories of now. It'll essentially be a drop-in centre, but it also, I think, will give us insight into lots of issues about migrants and who's on the breadline and who's struggling. But it will capture those conversations and life stories in a really raw way. And if I wait for the government to do it, I fear we'll still be here in some years' time.
Ruth, just finally on the cultural deficiency and what that means.
I was just thinking, I very much like what Ed was saying. It does sound a bit like David Cameron's Big Society. And there's nothing wrong, because I think kind of people doing things together is great.
But is
it
the
trouble is that some areas are more able to do it than others. And I think there has to be a basic infrastructure from which then people can build. And for me, libraries are part of that infrastructure, and they are, I would call them one of the sort of cultural right. I mean, it's a very specific, the right to have access to books. It doesn't, whether it's through libraries or whatever, it's not the library that's the right, but it's the right of access. I think what you said about Salazar was very, very interesting. But I think also that, cultural rights, I'm going back to group ATD Fourth World, who were some of the very poorest people in all different societies, both industrialised societies and other societies. And one of the things they found is the importance to some of the very poorest people of having access to culture and to being able to do culture, to be able to write poetry, to paint, have access to beauty. And these are, for me, part of what it should be about. Bread and roses. The roses are, in some ways, as important as the bread.